Hello, friends. Welcome to the Fountaindale Public Library's Genealogy Club program. And tonight's presentation is with Adam Selzer in his book, Graceland Cemetery. So if you're new to the Fountaindale Public Library Genealogy Club, welcome. We're happy to have you with us. We have 10 happy patrons online and about 10 happy people in the room. So overall, that makes me pretty happy overall. For our friends who are in the room and our friends who are watching online, we want to give a big thank you to the Illinois State Historical Society, who is co-sponsoring the event tonight. Remember that Illinois history is your history, and you are always welcome to join and become a member of the Illinois State Historical Society and to participate in its current memoir project, Illinois, a Land and Its People, which is where you can submit short essays, short memories, short memoirs from living in Illinois from 1946 to 1976. And we have more information available on our website, Illinois State Historical Society. So thank you so much to the Society for sponsoring. Thank you so much for watching. And tonight, friends, for Genealogy Club, super stoked because we were looking forward to having Adam with us tonight. Adam Selzer is the author of Graceland Cemetery, as well as a slew of other books, all of which you can see for our friends in the room. We have a big lobby display of all of Adam's books out in the lobby that he could actually take pictures of if he wanted to, knowing he gets the whole lobby tree all to himself. Which was pretty cool. We had enough of his books that it actually makes him look like he's very important. But we also know that he's been on many television shows and he's been in and around the Chicagoland area. And if we're being very honest, a friend actually referred me to his virtual tours during COVID, which is how, and yes, Pat, he is incredibly famous. Yes, Pat, he is incredibly famous, but I know he will say that, but he saved a lot of us, gave us a lot of opportunity to travel in and around Chicagoland and learn things that we didn't know during COVID with his fantastic series of online webinars. People were watching from all over the world, including some of my friends in China, in Germany, in Australia, and then of course here in the United States. So watched a lot of us during COVID and super grateful that he's here with us tonight. So with that, we're gonna hold questions till the end. So if you're watching online, friends, please put your questions in the Q&A area at the top or the bottom of your screen. And Adam, take it away. Thanks for being here with us tonight.
All right. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you very much for having me, everybody. Hi. All right. Welcome, everybody. This is the Genealogy Club meeting, I believe. If you want a Dr. Scott Science Refresher course, that's down the hall and to the right. But welcome along. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours, as they mentioned, author of the Graceland Cemetery book. Let's go ahead. Since we got the video up, let's just do the walk. Let's just show the walk into Graceland Cemetery video. Of course, this isn't what it's like anymore. They've redone this entire entrance now, so I'm a little bit out of date. I probably got to refilm this. But this is Graceland Cemetery up on the north side of Chicago. So I'll scroll through around here a little bit. Who's the founder of Graceland Cemetery? Is something wrong? It's not showing. It's not showing. Oh, we went all through this. We worked on this. Let's try stop share. And we will go to share screen again, and we'll try just under photos, or we'll try under the other photos thing. We'll try this quick.
Thank you for bearing with us. It's been a lot of technical issues.
Hey, well, while I'm talking, the History Channel just wanted me to do it in a show, but they wanted me not to wear the glasses. Does that seem like a bad idea to anybody else? Like not wearing the glasses? Like, why don't we also just like shave 10 years off of my age and start calling me Johnny Bravo? And well, like, yeah, Matinee Idol, yes. What if we did this one? I think this is still going to just show me one thing.
No,
at a time.
it shows it. Shows it.
Okay. What if we share screen, photos, share?
No glasses would be horrible.
Let's see, that's not doing it.
You just might have to stop and share your screen for every single thing.
Might have to do that, yes. I'd rather not.
Yeah,
that would
I
be
know.
Rather cumbersome.
Agreed.
But there, I feel like there's got to be like a preview. All right, we'll just, what if I put it like this? No, that's not doing anything, is it? What's it showing here? Still the folder?
Still the folder.
The folder. Okay, so we're gonna go to new share, and we'll just share that. There, everybody. Okay, slightly cumbersome, but we're gonna work with it anyway. So this, everybody, I know I can scroll through like that, right? And okay, I'm not gonna be able to know what I'm scrolling to next, so this may be a little bit of an adventure for all of us. But here, everybody, Graceland Cemetery, as it appeared before they redid the entrance and added a gorgeous new arch and a little picnic area over here where my old car was parked. But right up at the front, you can see these memorials that they've recently installed to William Butler Ogden, who is not buried here, but was the first mayor, George G.P.A. Healy, who was the treasurer and a portrait painter, and Thomas Barber Bryan, the founder of Graceland Cemetery, who himself is buried in Washington, D.C., and his wife's family. Sometimes it happens like that. This is Thomas Barber Bryan. He's almost like a Forrest Gump type character in Chicago history. This guy just pops up everywhere. He bought the handwritten draft of the Emancipation Proclamation from Abraham Lincoln, sold copies of it to fund the soldiers' home, the soldiers' rest home that they were building that is still standing to this day, very close to the tomb of Stephen Douglas that nobody ever goes to. He was the founder of the suburb of Elgin. He was the vice president at large of the World's Fair in 1893, and also quite possibly the single biggest individual swindling victim of H.H. Holmes, the Devil in the White City guy. Probably the only guy who knew both Abraham Lincoln and H.H. Holmes. But in 1855, he was married to Jenny Bird Bryan. This is a fantastic portrait of her. This is actually in the National Portrait Gallery in D.C. It's by G.P.A. Healy, his best friend, who painted a lot of people at Graceland, though most of the paintings don't seem to survive. But 1855, their son, Daniel, died. And Daniel was buried at the Old City Cemetery where Lincoln Park is now. And in a letter that Thomas wrote later on, he said that he found it absolutely repulsive in that cemetery. Not to mention that it was remarkably expensive. So he decided we have got to get a proper cemetery around here and started researching what was the very new art of cemetery management. Now, garden cemeteries that would actually be nice to go to, not the disgusting churchyards they had a generation before, was still a very new concept. Just within the last couple of decades, people had started building what they call garden cemeteries. Before that, you had places like Trinity Churchyard in New York, which there was one thing in the 1820s, a guy was hired to cover it with lime to try to keep the smell down. And he said the stench was so bad that it caused several of my men to cascade freely, which is a really cool way of saying puking, cascading. I love that. So he started researching things like irrigation and drainage, stuff that they hadn't really thought about with the Old City Cemetery in Lincoln Park. And also the financial side of it. How do you keep a cemetery going financially, even after you eventually sell all of the plots? Now, Graceland still finds new plots to sell now and then, but it's managed to remain financially solvent. Everything goes into a trust. So I don't know all of the details, but I know that even without a lot of sales and income coming in and with a lot of maintenance, they're still able to keep, they're still able to maintain a profit so far. So it took him about 5 years. He was way late a little bit because some other people said, hey, let's start one of our own, and started Rose Hill Cemetery a couple of years later. They managed to get off the ground a little bit faster. They offered Thomas Barber Bryan the chance to be the first president of Rose Hill. But instead, he just doubled down and said, no, I've got to really buckle down and figure my cemetery out. So Graceland managed to open in 1860. Once again, there's the entrance. As of now, there are something like 175,000 people there. Somewhere in that vicinity. This is a space that was originally going to be just an island with a little gazebo in the middle of the man-made pond. They did a lot of great landscaping for this. But when Daniel Burnham, the architect, died, you can look at the records. Just a couple of days after his death, his wife made arrangements to buy that island. It would be mostly ashes interred here. It wouldn't really handle full casket interments on a little island. But that's one of the cool things to me, is being able to go through these files and see sort of the weeds of it, see how things were put together. I'm going to scroll through a little bit to show some examples of this. Some of these are mine, some of them are not. But when you go through, every lot in the cemetery has a lot card. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to skip ahead a little bit here, try to Scroll through the hard way. Well, every lot has a lot record about like this. This is for lots 1B and section 1B, 1, etc. This is for Judge George Manier. You can see that right up at the top. The George Manier got his start in Chicago. He initially was working in New York supposedly working for the New York Mirror, a newspaper. His epitaphs all say that he wrote poetry for the New York Mirror. I went all through the New York Mirror trying to find one of his poems. All I found was a note from the editor saying to Mr. G.M., your sonnet is not bad or good. So he tried to write poetry for the New Yorker, for the New York Mirror. And when it came time to write the epitaph, nobody could really check whether he actually had or not. So they just took his word for it. But he became a judge in Chicago through most of the notable murder cases in the 1850s and 1860s, while on the side working on Underground Railroad stuff and finding loopholes that helped him fight the fugitive slave law in the 1850s. When he died, he was interred here at Graceland along with several family members. What you do in these lot cards, the audio is still coming through if I step this far away. Okay, so what you see on these lot cards, you can see at the top of it is Jeanette Manier, interred 10/28/1862. And then you see the next 4 or 5 of them below that. It's just the same date. This would generally mean that they died some years before. A couple of them further down, if you look on the edge, you can see 1859, 1852. That's before Graceland Cemetery existed. So on this day, 10/28/1862, this is when these other people would have been moved over from the Old City Cemetery. Presumably the Old City Cemetery. It doesn't really say. Yeah, it does actually. In the little red up at the top. See if I can zoom in on this. There we go. Yeah, up at the top, Jeanette Manier from City Cemetery. That'll show the space. She was 56. Harriet Chipman, some relative, 65. Louis Manier, scarlet fever at the age of 63. That's at age of 6 years and 3 months. You see a lot of scarlet fever death around the late 19th century, especially among children. John, age 2. Jesse, also scarlet fever. Then George himself dies 1863. And after that, these would all be people who were moved. Then the rest, you just follow the lot record along. We'll zoom back out. And this one is a large enough that it took 2 files. Then on the back, this is sort of a map of the plot and where each of those interments actually is. So you can see they're all numbered on this side, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we'll just, as an example, let's see if we can figure out where Jeanette is. That's number 1. So, and so she's right there. All right, so that can be helpful, especially in cases where a grave isn't actually marked. And I'm not sure if all of these actually have a marker within. You can see that in the middle it says Mon, that's the monument where it says Manier, then the road down over here. And from this, you can go through and figure out exactly where everybody is, especially if you're trying to locate a person's burial place, but don't know exactly where it is if it's not marked. This is how they figure it out. This is how they do it in the office. And to be more precise, if they really need to find something, they'll go out there with tri rods and poke. But I would imagine also these people who were from the 1850s and then moved over to here, there's probably not a lot left to find by poking. Nowadays, most people are buried in burial vaults. You can see down over here, that'll even specify. You can see Chicago Cemetery box. These ones you would actually find by poking, for sure, as these are much more solid stone. And so what you would also find within these lot records, I keep trying to scroll around here, these cumbersome buttons. So inside you can also find things like people's wills every now and then will be included in there. I'm trying to find a couple of good examples. There's some right at the beginning. No. Okay. So I can just get it back to my, yeah, like this is a Western Union telegram that was found in the Everhart family file. The Everharts have a mausoleum. This is their lot record. Shows all of the interments there, including Harry S. Everhart, very enterprising young man. He bought the courthouse after the Great Chicago Fire. Well, Thomas Barber Bryan bought it first. He loved memorabilia, but after he bought it, he realized he had no idea what to do with the thing. So he sold it to this 19-year-old kid named Harry Everhart, who had it melted down and made into thousands and thousands of miniature souvenir bells that he sold on the collector's market as a bell made from the old Chicago courthouse bell. They still pop up on the collector's market now. Initially, he made quite a lot of money from them, but after a few years, they were being given away as like prizes that came with chocolate boxes, which is much better than when you get in Cracker Jack nowadays. It's all just stickers now. So this is on the inside of it. There's this Western Union telegram. Elvis Mella Everhart Faraday, daughter Margaret L. Everhart, deceased, who owned lot 14, Lakeside Section, Graceland Cemetery, passed away here. Stop. Mrs. Faraday held warranty deed and requested entombment, Everhart Mausoleum. Stop. Mrs. Faraday bequeathed $1,000 in will to Graceland Cemetery. What purpose this was for? Stop. Was this for? Stop. Nephew and sole heir George Smith desires leaving here with body Thursday or Friday. Stop. Can Mrs. Faraday be placed in mausoleum? What are requirements? Stop. Metal casket measures 82 inches long, etc., etc. Stop. Wire full information. Interesting. So he was sending this telegram saying, okay, I'm bringing this casket. Is that going to fit? She's got $1,000. Now, $1,000. This is dated 1932. I should really do a voice like this. Mrs. Faraday has died. No. So, $1,000, 1932 money. That's about $20,000 to $30,000 today, which is more than it necessarily costs to have somebody entombed in an already existing mausoleum. But these things require a lot of maintenance. These above ground mausoleums, a lot of them, after about 50 years, are going to need 5 or 6 figures worth of maintenance. Right now, they're doing the Harris Mausoleum at Rose Hill Cemetery from the Harris Bank family, which I'd always wanted to see inside of. I finally got to a couple weeks ago. See, it's a big tower of a mausoleum, but on the inside, what you can see through the door is there's just a pit going into the ground with a ladder. I always say there's an easy joke here about where bankers go when they die. But I finally got to see into it. It goes down about 15 feet underground. There's space for something like 36 interments down there, but it's also right by a pond. Having a pit going into the ground right by a pond like that is a terrible idea structurally. And I'm guessing it's probably mid 6 figures worth of maintenance they're doing on this year. They just had the similar thing a few decades back. Which of your great-great-great-grandchildren do you think wants to get that bill? So I just don't recommend mausoleums for this reason, but a $20,000 bequeathment would probably not be a bad move. But the way to find these things first is they have an old card catalog. They still have a card catalog at Graceland Cemetery. So you can look through that. That'll show you which folder to go into. I'm going to move ahead and show another one of the really cool things on the inside. This is also the probate files you can go through. You can see Henry Graves. They didn't have the right wrapper that day. He was not in fact insane. He was just dead. But that is Henry Graves, the guy who built the Eternal Silence statue. This one. Or the one that was built out of his money. In the probate, he's moving money around a lot, eventually put aside something like $250,000 for a family monument fund. Now, most of his family had died years before. They were moved to Graceland from the Old City Cemetery in 1873. He himself died about 1906, 1907. So $250,000 in 1907 money had been put away for the family monuments. And I did some research on this, and from what I can tell, really high-end estimate for what a monument like this would have cost at the time is maybe $50,000. So that leaves the question of what happened to the other 250 grams, the other 200,000 out of it. That's millions of dollars in today's money. As the will said, it had to be, it was for that purpose, but it's kind of up to the executor of the estate at the end. My suspicion, it was probably people from Hull House probably got it. It was probably went to that sort of fund. Louise de Kovenbaum, who was a big Hull House woman, who was related to him by marriage. Her signature is all over the probate file. But unfortunately, the papers of the sculptor Laredo Taft from that particular year are missing. So it's one of those mysteries we probably never will quite solve, but I'd love to dig further into it. We're going to move in. I want to show the key cabinet here. I'm just kind of going by. Okay, so this is the key cabinet. This is where they keep all of the keys to the mausoleums, which I always think is fantastic. It's cool because so many of them look really neat. Like this one, I believe this one is to the Schoenhofen pyramid, but it looks very similar to the Ryerson mausoleum one as well. And there's also these other ones that are like Swiss Army keys. They have to be folded out. Well, just as an example, this might take a second to load. But yeah, this is how this one works. That's locking it back up. Yeah, there's a whole mechanism. It's almost like putting a puzzle together, the way that you work this thing. So it's not just the key, there's also a whole stick that you have to go poking through. You have to line it up exactly right. Then turn it. But one of the most important tools that you have there for genealogy purposes is the interment books. And these are several books. It's not just one book inside of the cemetery office. It's several, which have a few different columns here. You've got the first one is where they're buried, well, the number of interments, then where they're buried, then the name, then the date of death, or the location. And over on the next page, you get the cause of death. That's where it gets interesting to me. In a lot of cases, this is the only record we will have of exactly what somebody is thought to have died of. Sometimes you can get that on the death certificate as well, but sometimes the death certificates are a lot harder to get, especially if it's from like somebody before the Great Chicago Fire. So to zoom in on one of them, this is one from October of 1866. We'll just zoom in here a bit. October of 1866 was a very bad cholera month. We had a few big cholera waves in Chicago. There was one in 1849, one in 1854, one in 1866. You can see this all the way down here. Cholera, 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 cholera infantum. That was a disease that struck children a lot. We now think it was, when they say cholera infantum, that probably meant malaria. They just hadn't quite diagnosed that yet. But then cholera, 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 cholera morbus, cold. Now, there are a few of these that are so difficult to read. We just will be in the office, like kind of turn them to the side or like look it up and down, seeing if, okay, if that's an A there, let's see if there's an A in this other word, and just trying to match things up. One day I just went through and tried to find all the people who died of old age. A lot of them were given the cause of death of old age. The youngest I could find was 52. Sometimes I think when they just went with old age when they didn't want to be bothered to find more information than that. Like there's a case of Thomas Walter Newberry, who is buried at Graceland. He died at sea. And in those days, usually when you died at sea, they buried you at sea, but somebody convinced them, hey, this guy's rich. We got to preserve the body. So they put him in a barrel of rum. And there was an urban legend that he's actually buried in the barrel of rum. Now, when this story got out about 20 years after his death, after the rest of his family had died as well, the Chicago Tribune got in touch with a person who was working the customs office in France at the time it came through. And he said, yes, we moved it to a proper column. But you have to wonder, how in the world did the Tribune ever find a guy who was working customs in France after 20 years that quick? It all seems a little fishy to me. Of course, the only one way to find out, of course, is to bring your shovel. But I think most likely they would have moved him into a proper casket. But where was I going with this story? Cause of death. Yeah, he died at sea. According to witnesses who were on the ship, he had seemed very out of sorts. And late one night, he was like walking through the ship, knocking on people's doors, saying, "Can you get my horses ready? I want to ride in the morning." Sounds to me like he had a stroke. Very difficult to diagnose without examining the patient. Sounds like a stroke, but they put him down as having died of old age. And he was just in his 50s as well. So most likely it was something else, but there was no autopsy or anything. That was just probably the easiest thing to put in the interment book. I'm going to take a chance here and try to get, all right. Let's just go through and see some interesting people. We'll just tell some interesting stories of people here. This is Edith Rockefeller McCormick. Did it not work? It didn't work. New share. That should do it. All right. Edith Rockefeller McCormick, the heir to the Standard Oil name and money, has this place over by the pond, though she was just in the vault at Graceland in the and underneath the chapel for about 30 years after her death. She had been married to Cyrus McCormick Jr., Harold Fowler McCormick, one of the McCormick sons. He eventually left her for an opera singer of questionable talent. Very Citizen Kane. One of the inspirations for Citizen Kane. Ganna Walska was her name. She herself grew up highly educated, eventually became a licensed analyst herself. But there's also a couple of children in the plot here with her, Edith and John Rockefeller McCormick, their son, both of whom died of scarlet fever. And this inspired Edith to start the McCormick Institute of Infectious Disease, where their main goal was they wanted to work towards a scarlet fever vaccine. And they did have one for a while. It wasn't found to be quite as effective as antibiotics. But after antibiotics came out, they you don't hear people dying of scarlet fever as much anymore. It's a lot more treatable now. More effectively, they also came up with the vaccine for diphtheria, which was administered on a massive scale. It used to be, if you go through those interment books, you'll see a lot of diphtheria. It used to kill a couple 100,000 people a year worldwide. And the vaccine has not wiped it out completely, but now every couple of years, somebody will still die of diphtheria. But that's a person every couple of years, not a couple 100,000 per year. So it's almost impossible to imagine. Here's Edith. It's remarkably hard to find a picture of Edith Rockefeller McCormick. But this is her, because as famous as she was, at one point she was estimated to be about the richest woman in the world, heir to the Standard Oil name and money. But for all of that and for what a socialite she was, it's hard to find pictures of her. She spent a couple of years being analyzed by Carl Jung. And one thing I always tell people, if you want your kids to be happy, don't be a billionaire. I mean, you find, they would have been millionaires at the time, not billionaires, but you adjust for inflation. One thing that you notice over and over is these robber barons and rich people just had the most miserable children. All of them. But she was analyzed herself and eventually became an analyst. But when she moved back to the States eventually, she mostly made the news by announcing and telling everybody who would listen that she was the reincarnation of King Tut's first wife. After the investigation into King Tut's tomb, the pictures of it were published in Life magazine, and she said, "I recognized that chair immediately. I sat in that chair many times." And Louise de Koven-Bowen would say later, we would just have to kind of sit there and listen as she said these things. She was a highly educated woman. She was so academic, all we could really do, we couldn't possibly argue against her. But it must have made for some very awkward dinner parties. But after her death, there wasn't a lot of money left. She had just been living in the Drake Hotel by then. And she and also a couple of her kids were just in the vault in their caskets for several decades until the McCormick family decided this has gone on long enough. I know that the family wasn't married to her anymore, but let's do something about this. So it was in the 1950s, years after her death, that an undertaker was brought in, and they actually opened the casket and said she'd been well embalmed, perfect condition. But it's amazing that I couldn't find more pictures of her, really. The way that I had to get this is one of her passport photos. And this is one of the most reliable ways that I have of finding people's pictures is passports in the 1910s and 1920s and 1930s. A lot of those you can get on places like Family Search. Ancestry, I believe, has them as well. The good thing is Family Search is free. Family Search, you can go through and find passports, and usually you have to do a little clicking because their picture will be on the back page, not the one that it actually brings you to. But once you get the hang of it, it's fairly easy, and some of the best pictures I have of some people are just those. Like this is Alice Getty. I could only ever find 2 pictures of Alice Getty. Both of them were passport photos. But her mausoleum is a lot more famous than she is. But this is her mausoleum at Graceland. Her father built it around the time her mother died back in the 1880s. Now, this was designed by Louis Sullivan. Louis Sullivan's one of our greatest architects, and not only is this by him, but this is almost a perfect example of his architectural style. Everything we associate with him, the arches, the ornamentation, like even the hinges on the gates of this thing are highly detailed and absolutely gorgeous. Frank Lloyd Wright said that this mausoleum was a work of art like a Shakespeare sonnet. It's a work of art. It's like everything about Louis Sullivan in miniature. Now, because of the architecture, we tend to forget that there are interesting people inside of it. In this case, well, her father was a lumberman. I'm zoomed in. Can't quite get the buttons on this. She grew up dividing her time between Illinois and Michigan as a kid. She wanted to be a composer when she was young, and eventually she was also going back and forth between Chicago and Paris. Wanted to be a composer, had some sheet music published all over the world. She was off to a very good start. But as a young woman, she decided to switch gears and become an expert on Asian art at a time when that was really not well known in the world. If you wanted to find out about Buddhism in the United States, you had a couple of books that you could find, and you'd have to dig for those. But she published a book through Oxford Press called The Gods of Northern Buddhism, Their History, Iconography, and Progressive Evolution Across the Northern Buddhist Countries. And I believe it's actually still in print. It's still considered a very good textbook on the subject of ancient Asian art in the United States. You couldn't get anything of her personality from it. That's how you know it's good academic writing. It's a very, very dry text. But during World War I, she switched gears again. She was living in France during World War I and quit her art studies briefly so that she could start a Braille printing press for soldiers who had been blinded during the war. In the 1920s, after the war had died down, she moved to Japan for a time and lived in a monastery with a Buddhist sect that is still not really that well understood. She was working on a manuscript about her time there in the 1930s, but she was back in France then. The Nazis raided the villa and are thought to have destroyed the manuscript. So she fled back to the United States, spent the last years of her life in New York studying Ilyana, the Syrian goddess of love. She never married, had a woman who was her study partner for many years, which in the 21st century gives us certain ideas. But she just was one of my favorite discoveries while researching for the Graceland Cemetery book. Because really what I was doing to find stories for that book a lot of times was just finding these interesting graves, starting with the most obvious ones, the famous ones, figuring out who all was in them and just looking them up. And very little had been written about Alice Getty since an obituary written by her study partner that was published in an art magazine around the time of her death in the 1940s. Now, going back further through, though, there were lots of newspaper articles about her when she was still alive. She was decorated by the French government for starting the Braille printing press. The vast majority of the articles about her, though, are very flippant and dismissive. It's just like, look what this high society girl is up to now. Now she's gotten into Buddhism. Now she's interested in Hindu studies. They never really take her that seriously. And if you look at the actual work, it's really very serious. Talking about things that she was planning to do for the war effort, things that she could help out during World War I. She became a really fascinating character who shouldn't have fallen through the cracks like she did. There's only a couple of real interviews I could find with her, a couple of things that would bring out her personality. But you can see that she had a kind of a lust for life. She had a zest for living and a zest for travel and was very excited about research. She had a lot of fun with this sort of thing, even when she was being very serious about it. I thought that was terrific. Also, Bruce Goff. Bruce Goff was an architect. And I love this whole section off of across the stream there. You can see the Goodman family mausoleum from the Goodman Lumber and also now the Goodman Theater. Bruce Goff was an architect who designed houses that looked like this. At a time when most people were growing plain black rectangles. Like Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, the architect we mostly associate with plain black rectangles, is just over to the left of this shot, actually. His gravestone is a plain black rectangle, not unlike his buildings. And this is another one of his places. You can see this a little bit of crystal is a leftover bit from this one of his houses that burned down a while back. It's a kind of crystal called cullet, the runoff from a glass bending. I've actually got a few chunks of this as well. They popped up on eBay, and I thought, well, that'll be fun to place the first bid and get outbid right away. And then I can say, hey, I once had a bid on these things. It's worth object lesson. But if the minimum bid is more than you really want to spend on some rocks, just don't make the bid. But now it is a cool thing to be able to pull out of the tours, too. I love this. It's like a Playboy room he designed. I believe this was actually a bachelor pad for somebody. Ooh. So Carter Harrison, there's a couple of interesting things we can find about this. Well, Carter Harrison was a mayor. His son, Carter Harrison Jr., is also interred in the same plot. And Carter Jr. also wrote a memoir about growing up in Chicago. And that was really interesting, talking about how he used to go ice skating all the way out to River Grove from downtown, and occasionally getting beaten up on the way by bullies who later worked for him as cops. Talked about hearing his parents singing "You Pie Dee, You Pie Da," which I thought was a song the Muppets wrote. There's a line in the Muppet version about underwear with ham on rye that I don't think his parents were probably singing, but it would be awesome if they did. And one thing he mentioned is a story that one time they had a country cousin coming to visit them during an absolutely terrible snowstorm that happened in the early 1860s. It was such a bad snowstorm that the Chicago Tribune didn't have an edition the next day. Everything was just a complete whiteout. And during that, from something completely unrelated, that cousin who was visiting died. And there was a lot of difficulty. They had to find someone to dress the body, and his father nearly died just trying to go 3 doors down to get somebody who could come and dress the body, let alone to find an undertaker. And within that plot, there is a grave right over behind that's IBB for Isabella Barbie. That would have been the name of the cousin. The cause of death, the date of death, depending on the source, is either December 31st or January 1st. And it actually matches up exactly what he said. If he hadn't written those 2 lines, we wouldn't know a thing about this woman. And even now, we don't really know a thing about her life. We just know how she happened to die. But really, we wouldn't even have any idea what the connection was in that lot record that has that name, or just her initials on the stone itself. But really more interesting to me than any of the Harrisons, and Edith Ogden Harrison, Carter Jr.'s wife, was also a very fascinating character. But behind is this mausoleum that's kind of falling apart. This one, you can, if you look really closely and the light is hitting it right, you can make out a name up on top. The name is Lane. And going through the lot records, I had always assumed, I couldn't read it at first without being able to see the card. I thought it was part of the Harrison family plot. When I realized it wasn't, I had to go through all of the maps and figure out exactly which lot this was, then match it to one of the cards. Turns out it was a woman named Lavinia Lane, or possibly Albina Lane. No 2 records seem to agree on even what her first name was. And I couldn't find that much about her, except for there was about a week that she made the news. One day she walked in to a judge's office, a judge, Van H. Higgins, and started cussing him out and beating him up. They were both in their 70s at this point, but apparently they had such a fight that they broke 3 windows in the courthouse. I would have paid really good money to watch this fight. Now, she said that the judge owed her money. And there's a lawsuit between the 2 of them. I can't figure out whether it was actually resolved or not. But stealing money from an old woman and never paying it back is frankly the kind of thing Van H. Higgins would have done. I found a few of his other adventures. He was a slimeball. But about a week after the fight, it was mentioned that Miss Lane is thought not to be stable. She recently disinterred the bodies of 2 children from her mausoleum at Graceland Cemetery and boiled the bodies in her kitchen. Now, trying to figure out more about her, even what was her name? Was it Lavinia or Albina? Most of the mausoleums at a cemetery, they try to open about once a year, just to check for structural damage, make sure everything is okay inside. Um, in the case of this one they never open. This one is kind of falling apart. They're kind of afraid that the door might be a load bearing door at this point. So what we have tried, there's enough cracks that I pulled every trick I know, just trying to get at least a little bit of a look inside. I didn't manage it, but I did get an awful rash on my wrist that lasted for a few days. So I really think the story about her boiling dead bodies is probably just something the judge spread around to try to get out of having to pay her whatever money he owed her. But I can't ignore the possibility that I might have angered a witch and activated a curse somehow. It's just a hazard of the profession when you go poking around in cemeteries like this. On the other hand, I feel like Lavinia would want someone to know her story. Maybe she just thinks I'm getting it totally wrong. That's the last thing in the world she wants to be remembered for, is beating up a judge. But frankly, I think beating up Van H. Higgins is a great idea. This was another particularly fascinating one. So you have to look at the little grave in the background here. The little one, there's one that says Papa. Right next to that on the left, we'll zoom in now. I think I can zoom in here. This other one that says Papa. The smaller one, a guy named Joseph Henry Hudlin. Now, Joseph Henry Hudlin was born enslaved in Culpeper, Virginia. There's a few different stories that circulated about how he escaped. The simplest version, they all kind of revolved around some version of this story, is he found that there was a riverboat that was going to be stopping in his town. So he got a chef's hat and just held up his hat and walked onto the ship as though he were working on the ship, pretended to be a chef until they got to Illinois, and then he just left. Made his way to Chicago, got a job as the janitor of the Board of Trade, and had that job for 50 years. His son had it for another 50 years after that. So for a good 100 years, there was a Joseph Henry Hudlin Jr. as the janitor of the Board of Trade. And he had an encyclopedic knowledge of all the times people had tried to corner the wheat market and stuff, but never, to my knowledge, tried to get involved in trading, because you probably saw right away that it was basically gambling. A lot of people made a lot of money, but a lot of people lost a lot of money. He found, though, that a lot of people would bring in samples of the grains that they were trying to sell. At the end of the night, they would just leave them, so he would take them and sell them to feed stores. And over the course of his career, made something like $100,000 like that. And that's $100,000 in 1870s money. So you adjust for inflation, you're well into the millions. So he probably made a lot more than most people in the Board of Trade. He was also involved in Underground Railroad. He had a brother who also escaped and was living in Alton, Illinois. People would escape from Missouri, from St. Louis, and get over to Alton. He would come down to Alton and meet them and accompany them up on the train to Chicago. And some would stay in Chicago. Some would get on board a ship. There was a ship particularly called the Great Western that sailed around the lakes. Captain Walker, who piloted it, was only too happy to somehow not notice that he had several more Black crew members when he left Chicago, and also not to notice when they were no longer present after he left Detroit, from which they would have gone across over to Windsor, Ontario. And so Hudlin, we don't know how many people he might have rescued like this. One of the difficulties of researching Underground Railroad stuff is if they got away, we don't necessarily have the records of it. But this is where it gets a little bit weird, is that he's not really buried right here. He's actually in the next plot over. You see this stray stone that's kind of tilted. The Hudlin family marker, the Hudlin family lot record, just has that. It's got a list of a few people who are buried there, including Joseph himself, and then a stone that's marked as base for monument. There's just the base. The family, for whatever reason, never got around to actually adding the monument there. So, but one of the things in the record as well is there was a name that was crossed out, like somebody who had been buried there temporarily and then moved. That name was Mary Ann Stevens, the name on the monument in the next plot over, his surrounds. So what most likely happened is that they would have been friends and neighbors. And when Mary Ann died and didn't have a plot, Joseph said, "Oh, you can bury her in my plot until you get one of your own." So they would have buried her there. And then when the family got enough money to buy their own plot nearby, they just moved her over. And at some point, they also decided to add a marker for Joseph himself. Mary Ann, we don't know too much about, but she was the mother of Martha Gray, who is seen here. And what little we do know about them is that they were both Black women from Missouri who came to Chicago in the late 1850s, which would have been over the Underground Railroad. So the most likely scenario here is that these were people that Joseph Hudlin had helped escape. And presumably for that reason, they decided to put a marker up for him in their plot nearby his own. And just to stretch this out, also, Willis Montgomery, the person next to Joseph, there's a typo on his gravestone, but he had come up from Kentucky in the 1850s. And most likely the same scenario, probably coming up on the Underground Railroad. Now, as far as the personalities for these people, the only thing I can really tell you that I could find is Martha Gray died in here in 1918, it says. But a little while before that, when she was like 80, which would have been like 80 years old, it was reported in the press that she had gone to New Orleans for the Mardi Gras. I think that's fantastic. Mardi Gras Granny. And that was a fascinating one to put together. And all we can really do is, nobody wrote down, here's why we're putting Joseph in this plot. Now and then in the files, you will find something like that they wish to be buried next to each other just out of firm affection for one another. Now and then you can find a letter that mentions someone else in the plot next to mine is my sister. We never would have known that otherwise. That can come up now and then as well. But in this case, they didn't really comment on what the symbolism or what their thought process was. We can only really speculate. I do know that a couple of them went to the same church. That doesn't necessarily tell us much. I got a couple more minutes. Let's find another story. The fun thing about doing the Graceland talks is I've just got Inez, of course, is the most popular story at Graceland. She's a girl who died of diphtheria. Her name was Inez Briggs. It looks like it's Inez Clark on the monument. Clark was a name that her mother had just taken on. She just married a guy named Clark around the time Inez died. And I've never been able to find a wedding date for Mary, her mother, and John Clark, who would have been her stepfather. But there's a letter in the files around the time Inez died when they were setting this up, a letter from the mother where she calls herself Mary Briggs in the signature. She says, I, Mrs. John Clark, and then signs it Mary Briggs. From which I can assume that it must mean the wedding had only just happened and she wasn't quite used to using her new last name yet. So she was used to calling herself Mary Briggs in signature. So this is one of my favorite shots. It's right next to the coyote running by. Now and then I get a good shot of Inez with the coyotes. There's two of them in this shot. Now there's a legend that when there's a thunderstorm, Inez will disappear and her ghost will run around the cemetery. And you can see this one was on a rainy day. Every time it rains and I'm there, I check. And so far, I have not seen her disappear. Just going to mention this guy briefly, Perry H. Smith. He had a mansion in the Gold Coast with 3 faucets in the sink, one for cold water, one for hot water, and one for champagne. La-dee-da. This was another fascinating one. And this one I made a mistake. I always thought this was a Henry Hobson Richardson architectural work. It's more in Henry Hobson Richardson's style. It probably was not one by him specifically, but this big named Potter up on top. Occasionally joke, this is like a piece of Harry Potter fan fiction just waiting to happen. This is actually the tomb of a guy named O.W. Potter. It took me some doing to find that first. I couldn't, there's no first names on this or anything. It wasn't until I learned to go through the files and the catalogs that I could figure this out. O.W. Potter was a steel baron. I couldn't find a whole lot about him other than a lot of articles about how rigid he was about his reputation. He didn't want anything to make him look like he was not a pure gentleman. Unfortunately, he had a daughter who was a little bit. She was awesome, was what she wanted. His daughter, Margaret Potter, was an author. She was 16 when her first book came out. So it was called A Social Liar. It was based on a wild and crazy classmate that she has. It sounds to me like she really had a crush on her. And it was all considered to be a satire of Chicago high society. It was considered highly shocking when it came out, so much so that her father tried to buy up and destroy every single copy before it could besmirch his reputation. Now, that did not hurt sales one bit. Places that normally would not have noticed were taking out ads saying, yes, we have copies of A Social Liar. I've read it. It's very difficult to see exactly what the big deal is. She wrote a number of books. She went on to have a career that lasted the rest of her life. She didn't live to be particularly old, but she did at least a book a year. You can get them all for free on Google Books now. I'm not going to say they're lost literary masterpieces. They're kind of pop fiction of the day. Most of them were historical fiction. She died of a chlorodyne overdose. That was a drug that you took to get off of morphine. Now, she was working a really punishing schedule. She would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning every day and write until noon. Then she would go to the Newberry Library and research until they closed. The staff was kind of in awe of her. And they closed at probably 5 o'clock, but then she still had high society stuff to do all the time. And she went to every single home Cubs game. Never missed a Cubs game. She did not live long enough to see Wrigley Field, but she loved to be as close to Wrigley Field as she is. She'd love knowing that from her tomb, her mausoleum, you can hear the sound of the crowd at Wrigley Field. I think it's probably that schedule that probably got her involved in narcotics. Kind of the Judy Garland plan. You take something to get up, take something to go down. Before they really knew how bad that was for you. The chlorodyne, the drug that she ended up overdosing on, it was a mixture of cannabis and laudanum. You can't get it anymore. I've looked. It's the cannabis you can, the laudanum you can't get. There's a variation of opium. You really just can't get opium. This one was one of my absolute favorites. Just covered this one before we go to questions. So this one really is completely illegible. I walked by it dozens of times without even really stopping to think about it until I was doing virtual tours the first year of the pandemic and decided around October when the leaves all changed, like, I'm going to do a virtual tour of just Graceland and autumn. Well, I'll just get footage of all of the stuff that looks the best, no matter who it is, and I'll just find out who it was and tell the story, even if there's just some boring businessman. And a lot of times I'll even find these guys wrote autobiographies and didn't find a single interesting thing to say about themselves. A lot of these guys were frightfully dull, but this turned out to be a guy who was so frightfully dull that people were still making fun of him for it 50 years after he died. It turned out to be an entire large plot just with one guy, Jeremiah Price, who initially was buried in the Old City Cemetery. Now, one guy who was reminiscing about him in the 1890s said, I was a young man in the 1850s. I wanted romance and adventure. Finding nothing like that in Jeremiah Price, I didn't take much notice of the man. If he had any imagination at all, it did not extend beyond the alphabet and the multiplication table. And Jeremiah Price was a land speculator. He had no friends, no family. Nobody seemed to like him very much. But decades later, a guy remembered the day in 1854, he came into the apothecary shop. And the apothecary said, it's been terrible. So many people are dying of cholera. Jeremiah Price is going to be next. And the young man said, well, how do you know? I said, well, Jerry, he came in here an hour ago. And I said, well, Jerry, what is the problem? And he said he had quite a diarrhea. And I told him that was the first symptom of cholera and he should really get to a doctor. And he said, no, I'll just have some peppermint lozenges. I really wish he had added, like, I've done my own research. Not that you could actually have taken anything that would really help with cholera, but peppermint lozenges certainly did not. And the next morning, they found him not only dead, but with $20,000 in cash and securities strapped to his chest like he was trying to take it with him. But you can't do that. And he had also not written a will and did not have any close relatives. So this was 1854, that cholera epidemic. They used some of the money to build him a monument and have him buried in the Old City Cemetery. But then a decade or so later, they closed the Old City Cemetery. In the early 1870s, when they were just about done moving everything out of there, they were still going through his probate. This had been over 20 years now. At one point, they had sold off all of his personal effects. Long John Wentworth, our mayor and congressman at various times, showed up at the auction to spike the lemonade to try to get people to bid on any of his stuff. So he didn't have much that anybody actually wanted. So after 20 years, a judge granted leave to use some of the money in the estate to have him moved over to Graceland Cemetery. So they used a lot. They bought him a very large plot all to himself under a very nice tree, very nice location. I think the monument used to be bigger. I think there was probably an urn up on top of it at one time that fell apart years and years ago. And it would be wonderful if I could find an old enough picture that it still had the urn on it or something. Sometimes you can find stuff like that, pictures of monuments that are falling apart. My new project is at Trinity Churchyard in New York. There's a lot of monuments there that are so worn away that by the time they even started keeping records, they didn't know what it ever said. But a couple of them I've managed to figure out who it was. Sometimes you'll find something like an old architectural magazine from the 1850s that'll talk about a certain one and be able to triangulate where it was. In this case, I found this just in time to add him into the Graceland Cemetery book. And ever since I did, people have started showing up on my tours with peppermint lozenges that we leave on Jeremiah Price's grave. That's one of my favorite things that has happened because of the book. I'm kind of going light on time. Do you have any questions now?
Hold on. I've got one from our friends online. Dee has a question.
Hi, Dee.
She says, hi, Adam. How do you gain access to interment record books like what you have? Except in one cemetery, the offices have not been helpful.
That can be a thing. Most of the offices are not quite this helpful.
Right. So it looks like she's having issues with any properties managed by Dignity Memorial.
Yeah. Dignity Memorial runs most of the cemeteries in Chicago and really all over the country. They've been buying up cemeteries. They're not as forthcoming with records like that. Most of them, what I find is it depends if you know what you're looking for. Like if you can just check a cause of death for somebody, if you get the right person working the desk, they're usually willing to help. My best advice is be charming.
Be charming and send a gift basket.
Occasionally, be ready to claim that you're somebody's descendants. You don't necessarily have to have the same last name. A couple of generations pass and last names change. And sometimes that worked for me better than others. Sometimes you just have to get lucky. Graceland, luckily, is very forthcoming with their records. They also have an online burial search that really, really helps. I really wish the Dignity Memorial ones would have an online search function. That would make things a lot easier. On Fridays, as many of you watching know, I do a thing called Find a Grave Friday, where I go to a cemetery and live stream a bit. I know I'll find out that someone is buried in this particular cemetery, but I won't look up where exactly they are or what the monument looks like or anything. People figure that out in the comments. And then we play hot and cold until I find it. And sometimes at Graceland, it's always very easy because if all else fails, I have very detailed maps at Graceland. Plus, they have the burial function. At Rose Hill, it can take a while. If it's one at Rose Hill, I'll have a friend do some recon just to like check their find a grave, see if it gives a plot record, see if there's a photograph or something. Don't tell me, I don't want to wreck it. But at Dignity Memorial places, that tends to be if somebody hasn't like posted a picture of it someplace. And sometimes it'll be a picture, we'll just have to like triangle. There's a street light visible in the background of the picture. And if it's a small cemetery, then sometimes that's enough. But there have been days we've been out there for a really long time. Hopefully the weather's good.
That's fair. Thanks, Dee, and thanks for that question. We appreciate you. Are there any questions from our friends in the room? And if you have a question, Adam, would you please repeat it so our friends online can hear it? Thank you.
My friend, it's your time to ask a question.
Yeah. The story about the girl in the glass case. So Inez, and this is one that took a lot of this. There's been so many urban legends about Inez over the years. She asked if I could go into more detail about Inez and why she's in a glass case. Now, there have been a lot of urban legends about this. And at one point, about 15 years ago, the cemetery claimed that she never existed. This was the time period when there were like 9 or 10 ghost hunting shows on at any given time. And people were showing up with gear and even expecting like really weird permission, like camp out overnight at her grave, or people would probably show up with shovels or something. And the cemetery just got kind of tired of dealing with it. They tried to look her up and not found anybody named Inez Clark in any records anywhere. So they said that this was probably just a statue that was built as an advertisement for the sculptor, which I've never heard of anybody actually doing. But a genealogist did some work and found that no, there wasn't an Inez Clark, but he looked up the Rothrocks who were buried next to her and found that they were living with a girl named Inez Briggs, who did die the same day that this Inez did. He was able to pull a death certificate. The old legend was that she had been killed in a lightning storm. She died of diphtheria. as it turned out. And I expanded on that a bit. I went to the legal archives, the 11th floor of the Daily Center building. Really, it's just card catalogs and microfilm indexes in there, but you can go through and find divorce records. You can find lawsuit records, things of that nature. So what you do there is you find the number of a case and you turn it in at the desk, and then you can go back in about 3 weeks. They have to get it all from offsite storage. And in this case, I found her mother's divorce record. It turned out her mother, Mary, was about 16 when she married a guy named Wilbur Briggs in the home of the Rothrocks, her mother and stepfather. So about a year later, Inez was born. And about a year after that, Mary went to Wilbur and said, if you don't cut back on the drinking, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. And he just said, I'll save you the trouble, and simply left. It was a couple of years later, she was able to get a divorce. It was a while, partly because judge was going to ask questions like, have you been a faithful wife? Did you do everything you could to make the home a happy one? That's in the divorce record, those exact questions. And about 5 months after Wilbur left, she became pregnant again. There was a boy named Delbert who died of cholera infantum. It's a little marker on the right is for him. And when Delbert was alive, she couldn't have answered those questions honestly. Not from a legal standpoint anyway. But after Delbert was gone, she just when the judge asked those questions, she just sort of glossed over it. When he asked how many children have you had, she said 1. And Wilbur never answered the summons or anything, so she ended up getting full custody. I have no idea who Wilbur's father was, but you know what? It's none of my business. So what I found, most of that just came out of the divorce record. There was a testimony from her mother and some testimony from Mary herself. From the sound of it, the grandparents were mostly the ones raising Inez. Mary still lived with them. Mrs. Rothrock said, I have always cared for Inez, and I always can. And then she died just a few years after that. There's a couple of pictures of it in the archives where it does not have a glass case over. But there's also a little note from the 1930s that they'd agreed to remove some of the curbing, the coping that was around it. It used to be a lot more of the plots had curbs around, like barriers. A lot of those were taken out starting in about the 1870s. They kind of went out of fashion. Some of them were taken out of this plot in the 1930s. My guess is that might be when they added the glass case, except that I think that if it had been that long, the statue would not be in as good a shape as it is. So there are some pictures of it without a glass case. I don't know when exactly it was added. They don't have a record of that. But somewhere along the line, somebody decided to add a glass case to it, mostly just to protect it from the elements. There are other statues around the cemetery that were not encased, and more of them around Rose Hill. You can see the difference. Marble is really a bad material for keeping outside. That's one of the bigger problems at Trinity Churchyard. So many of the monuments were made out of marble. Within about 20 years, they would have been illegible. So this one is in remarkably good shape. We don't know when exactly they added it, but I'm glad that they did. It's just so well preserved. It was a guy named Andrew Gagel sculpted it. I don't know of any of his other work that I could find. He took out ads saying that he could make any kind of statue you wanted. I'm sure there must be others out there, but that's the only one I know of that's still extant. Only one I can think of offhand. I had to look up and see if I can find some more of those. That'd be a whole other rabbit hole. I don't think his papers are on file anywhere. And often, sometimes there's a cross monument that if it wasn't for somebody an offhand mention in somebody's reminiscence of the Great Chicago Fire, we wouldn't know that monument was sculpted by Leonard Volk, who did a lot of the statues around Rose Hill. And Abraham Lincoln's life mask. And Senator Douglas's death mask, for that matter. It's really creepy looking. All right.
Are there any other questions? We're in one last call for questions online. And friends, any questions in the room before we close out? I know we have a lot of anxious people who want to meet Adam, talk Adam, probably get pictures taken with Adam, but we do have 2 door prizes here for the folks who are attending in person. So I will draw for that when we close today. But any last questions before we close?
Yes, next weekend on the 18th, I have a Graceland tour. It's going to be one of our supersized Graceland tours. One of the hardest things at a Graceland tour is they're normally about 90 minutes long. And I have to walk past a lot of stuff just to be able to get all the way to be from one end of the cemetery to the other and back. I have to skip a lot of story, skip a whole lot of streets or a whole lot of paths. So the supersized one, we at least skip fewer of them because it's a double length. So that one is coming up on the 18th, and then I will probably Memorial Day weekend, I'll do one at Rose Hill as well. Probably just a regular length one at Rose Hill.
Fantastic. And thank you, friends who are watching online. I've just dropped into the chat. I've dropped our upcoming events that we have coming up for Genealogy Club. On Wednesday, May 22nd, we have Wanted Seeking Unknown Parents at 11 a.m. Central Time. The link to the registration is in the chat, as well as our next hybrid program is June 12th, which is Illinois Prison and Penitentiary Records, which is on a hybrid format like what we have tonight. So you're more than welcome to watch that online or visit us in person here in Meeting Room A at the Fountaindale Public Library. We also have in June 26th is another virtual program. You can take it with mobile virtual genealogy tools, and that is at 11 a.m. Central Time. So we want to make sure that you have that option to join us. All of our programs are free. Put away your credit card, no library card required. We'd love to have you back with us. So thank you, friends, so much for joining us this evening. We have some great feedback, Adam. HCE says thanks to Adam and Fountaindale Public Library. Thank you, HCE. Thank you, D. Your knowledge is admirable and your humor appreciated. Thank you for a terrific presentation. And Pat and Cynthia both say thank you. So thank you, friends. We're just going to sign off. We're going to hang out like we always do, and we'll catch you at the next Genealogy Club meeting. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.